Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a little bit surprised by the turnout, to be honest. It's fantastic. Look, when I reflect on certainly the last 20 years that I've been involved in climate policy development in New Zealand, the thing that's has struck me more latterly as we've started to have a much bigger conversation about adaptation is how much time and energy we've spent as a country talking about mitigation, and how much that took up the oxygen in policy debates, in science, research, and very much in terms of the national narrative about what needs to be done for New Zealand in the context of a changing climate. So it is great that we've got today very much focused on adaptation, and there's such a great attendance from many people from many organisations part of this discussion. For me, it's urgent, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that this conversation is urgent. But I want to step back in time first of all and provide a little bit of context about why regional councils are part of this conversation. And it goes back to 1938, when a major weather event happened on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand, and it was 50 years almost to the day prior to Cyclone Bowler. And in 1938 we had an awful lot of east coast hill country that had been relatively recently deforested, and that weather event resulted in mass erosion and sedimentation of some lowland rivers and adjacent communities, and it was a significant disaster with great loss of property and massive loss of natural capital. That event, which was pretty profound in the region that I now work in, resulted in the 1941 Soil Conservation Rivers Control Act. And that act is what created catchment boards and was really the forerunner to regional councils of today. So I think it's just worth reflecting from I guess a local government design perspective that regional councils have their genesis in a major weather event impacting upon our rural landscapes. But of course we've seen plenty in the meantime, and this photograph's from 2011, just up the road from where those other photographs were taken. That's just near Wairoa, Lake Whakakī in the distance for those of you that know the Wairoa district. And I guess the point for me around that is that the vulnerability of our landscapes as they were in 1938 are still very much part of the vulnerability of our hill country for agriculture today. And those hills there, many of them are still very much in their naked state. And slowly but surely, those hills, in my view, are getting closer and closer to bedrock and a complete inability to support any form of agriculture. And it has been since 2011, certainly in our district, the experience of an increasing, at least anecdotally, an increasing frequency and intensity of rainfall events that are very much driven by warmer seas around New Zealand and North Island. And last year we had 2 events in pretty quick succession, which were very localised. But what was happening there was that warmer temperatures created more tropical weather systems than we are used to seeing. And when we have these very, very vulnerable landscapes, I guess what we're experiencing is an acceleration of processes that we might have expected to take much longer. And the processes whereby soil is formed on those hills is overwhelmed by the frequency of these events. So, look, our contemporary context for regional councils is very much around a tradition of being at that interface between weather, the climate, and land use and the impacts on communities and managing those. So at one level we've been at this for a long time. But as I said before, we've got an awful lot of landscapes that are still very vulnerable, and we're very much now playing catch up. The biggest driver of activity happening in regional councils, as I think probably everyone in the room will be acutely aware, is freshwater reform. So National Policy Statement, Freshwater Management, is driving a level of activity for regional councils around planning and implementation of those plans, which is unprecedented in terms of reforms under the Resource Management Act since 1991. It's a much greater level of regulation for both farming and forestry coming from the National Policy Statement, and to support the implementation of that regulation is much greater on-farm engagement and assistance to landowners than ever before. So we're stepping into a space for freshwater reform that is far more active, very resource intensive, and is fundamentally changing the relationship between regional councils and landowners. We've also are setting water allocation limits as part of that, so quantity limits, and that's changing the nature of the availability of resources and creating a far more finite box in which people need to operate. So as water availability changes from a changing climate, we've got some fixed parameters that are going to need to accommodate that. Notwithstanding the fact that the National Policy Statement does require us to consider climate change, but my experience of freshwater reform is that the planning cycle is looking in much shorter timeframes than currently our climate science can help us with. At the same time, we're also looking, regional councils, at the adequacy of our flood protection and drainage networks. So a long history of getting water off land as fast as possible, seeing water as a problem, not as a taonga or as a resource, rethinking that, and now thinking about how do we re-engineer the way we manage water in urban landscapes and in drained rural landscapes in a way that preserves the ecological integrity of what was once there, while also managing water coming through. And then regional councils also in the business of civil defence and emergency management, and obviously a big focus on increasing our resilience in that regard. And then of course biodiversity. Once upon a time we were focused on killing rabbits and possums. Now regional councils are far more looking at whole ecosystem health as well. So look, there's a lot on. Lots to do for regional councils, and a real challenge for us with finite resources and very limited capability to prioritise that and find the synergies in everything that we're doing to get as many win-wins as possible. The connection between freshwater and climate change policy should be pretty self-evident, but we do have these two things coming together at us. We're managing contaminants, nutrients, and in particularly, as I mentioned before, sediment. It is the biggest driver of freshwater quality and of ecological harm in the freshwater environment in many parts of the North Island of New Zealand. And we have over 1 million hectares of highly erosion-prone land that we know of in the North Island. So we have a big challenge on the freshwater side, but we actually run the risk of that problem accelerating with climate change. And then we've got infrastructure we're trying to protect and communities with that. And then we've got relatively fast-moving land use from economic drivers, but also policy drivers, and yet we have an RMA planning system that is famous for its low level of agility and its heavy focus on litigation, which slows communities down from making decisions at speed and being agile. And if that wasn't enough, then we've got changing biology and the biosecurity incursions that come with that. So it's a pretty challenging landscape for regional councils, but I think there are some opportunities in that. And for me, the biggest opportunity of it all, which I don't miss the opportunity to chew the ear of central government policy makers around, and I note that the OECD in their environmental review of New Zealand in 2017 said very much the same thing, and that is that we've got to find where these different policy drivers interconnect and really focus on those connections where we put our energy. And between freshwater reform and climate, for me, is really that sweet spot. We are having this once in a generation and probably what will become a permanent feature of the way in which environmental regulators intersect with landowners around farm planning, and a huge amount of engagement around the whole farm system and what it's delivering by way of environmental outcomes. And I think the opportunity is to bring climate into that conversation and to look at climate change, risk and resilience on farm and plan what we're doing with that in conjunction with what we're doing around freshwater quality and biodiversity. We know that we've got a big afforestation job on erosion-prone land, but we've got to also find those opportunities to enable ruminant agriculture to coexist, and there is a lot of opportunity around space planting of a range of species. Riparian management, yes, we need to get greater shading, and we need to get stock away from waterways, but we also have a stream bank erosion issue. In my region alone, the modelling suggests that over 1 million tonnes of soil is lost annually from stream bank erosion. So if we know that we're going to have an increasing frequency and intensity of heavy rainfall events, we know that's going to accelerate stream bank erosion. So again, another reason for stock exclusion, riparian fencing, etc. And I think when we're having these conversations about farm system change, there is this opportunity to talk about greater diversification, to make farm systems more resilient. Alternative species, we know we need more pasture species resilience, but also we've got opportunities with horticulture and arable systems and a range of different things, as well as agroforestry. So again, we're having this conversation with landowners. We know that they're going to be facing a changing physical environment. There is that opportunity to make a conversation which started off one around regulation and fresh water, being a far more holistic one about how we support land use change in the coming century. While we do have that wonderful opportunity, we are greatly constrained in our ability to execute on the ground right now. And I think capability is the big challenge, not only for regional councils, but it is for industry good organisations, it is for the agricultural sector, it is for central government, it is for CRIs. Right across the country, we have a scarcity of resource, and we've probably got a significant proportion of the capability nationally on that sitting in this room. And yet we do have tens of thousands of landowners, millions of hectares of land, and an awful lot of things to manage. I am hopeful, though, that science is going to help out in a big way. The Deep South National Science Challenge is bringing an Earth Systems model forward that will give us finer scale prediction around how climate change impacts will impact on New Zealand. That's something we can bring down to regional scale and hopefully even finer scale again. We do have some tools in the toolbox, but we need an awful lot more of those. We are going to have to upskill and grow the scale of our community of people working with landowners for all of the reasons that I've outlined. And we do know that too few of our farmers today do sufficient budgeting planning for their futures. And so with this opportunity to start a conversation around long-term change and farm planning, there is a need to upscale at the land manager, landowner end as well. And then sitting in all of this, I see a real trust and confidence issue. I know when the Regional Council goes to have conversations with landowners, for many of them, and it's not universal, but for many there is a great trust issue right from the start. So when you start talking about climate change and start talking about fresh water, we're starting from a position of distrust and concern. So there's a big job to do there. And I guess over all of this, what I'm seeing is a lot of good intentioned effort, but it's pretty nascent in many areas. And there is a lack of total system coordination between industry, central government, local government, the research community around the whole farm system change piece. And I do think that what we do need as a country is to recognise that land use change has been with us since the beginning of human habitation on this land, but the threats to not changing land use fast enough with a changing climate fundamentally threatens the underpinning of the New Zealand economy and creates significant natural hazard risks to New Zealand. So we do have a window of time in which this country's really got to grip up, in my view, the land use change challenge and work out what is the entire infrastructure between public and private we need to put in place to support landowners to go through that change. If we turned up to New Zealand today and it hadn't been modified at all and we decided we were going to build a primary sector, we would know with a reasonable degree of confidence how we would change land use, what we would sacrifice, how we would design things. And so for me, the thought experiment is that actually we have a lot of the tools and knowledge to re-engineer our agricultural landscapes to be far more resilient and far more ecologically friendly and probably more productive and profitable as well. The challenge we've got is we've disaggregated that opportunity into tens of thousands of individual small to medium-sized businesses with their own individual people running them. And so it's a huge social and cultural challenge that we face as a country, in my view, to connect with those people and help them go through this change. I haven't got all the answers for how that might go about being designed, but it seems to be a bit of a burning platform from where I'm standing. So I'm happy to throw that challenge to you all through the duration of this conference and for the work that you'll do from here. Kia ora koutou.